of IO Technology Solutions.
Question again, can I stop you there again? Just in terms of the BT valuation, I mean, you do these things, you know, all the time. What is your view on the value of BT, that 30% stake? I mean, it's said it's R1 billion, but what's your personal view on the valuation? What should it be?
Mr. Chair, with respect to BT and their business, I don't believe the entire whole was even worth that much. In fact, I'd venture to say, again, in the 500 to 600 million rand was probably the entire value of BT South Africa.
100% of BT?
100% of BT, not
30%.
Correct, Mr. Chairperson.
Oh, interesting.
Round robin resolution of the Board of Directors of IO Technology Solutions Limited, the company. Pursuant to the authority given under the company's Memorandum of Incorporation and as read with Chapter 2, Part F, 73, Subsection 7 of the Companies Act 2008, we, the undersigned, being the directors of the company, who have the right to attend a meeting of the Board of Directors, agreed that such a meeting not be held, and we waive our right to receive notice in terms of Section 74(1) of the Companies Act. And by signing the resolution, we indicate that we have voted in favor of the adoption of the resolution for purposes of Section 74 of the Companies Act. It is resolved that, 1, to manage the investments of the company, it was decided that the company maximizes its returns and manages its risks by deploying its cash on hand. 2, the company agreed to invest 1.5 billion rand with various asset managers. 3, the company also agreed to invest up to a maximum of 400 million rand per asset manager. 4, Nahid Khamildin, in her capacity as Chief Financial Officer, be and is hereby authorized to sign the investment agreements between the company and the various asset managers on behalf of the company. We were completely flabbergasted by this resolution, especially after the 400 million rand had already gone to Three Laws Capital under the same guise of de-risking the cash sitting in one account. This proposed resolution broke every governance rule in the book and was everything wrong that was with IO. It was a round-robin resolution to move over a third of the company's cash to unknown asset managers. This resolution was not even at the instance of the executive directors of the company, who, by the way, were all sitting in an ExCo meeting when it was received for signature. This resolution authorized a single signatory in Nahid to effectively sign away 1.5 billion rand of the company's money, the very same person that was called to transfer 400 million rand to Three Laws Capital back in March at the insistence of Iqbal through Khalid Abdullah. I had no doubt that the resolution had been drafted at the insistence of Iqbal.
Thank you. Just before you continue, the question would be relating to my earlier statement at the opening, who those asset managers were, the related party linkages, and in terms of this resolution or this information, I trust that Ms. Khamildin will be appearing before the Commission. Yes?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Yes, she will.
Yeah, just something to understand here. If you're going to acquire businesses within a year without the 4.3 billion, why are you putting money in asset managers? I mean, if you're putting it on stock market and it falls by 30%, I mean, sort of wipes out part of the money. I mean, was this in money market funds or what?
Mr. Commissioner, I have no idea, and that is a very good question.
We'll ask the question, I think, somewhere when the others are here.
Throughout the entire period, I was being requested to sign a due diligence mandate with Vunani Capital that would see Vunani charge IO a 2% fee for all the work that they did in assessing our proposed transactions. We would still have to pay for all legal, audit, and tax advice on top of the 2% that they would charge. In protest, I termed it the acquisition tax that had to be paid to Vunani for the failure of the Sagamartha listing. Vunani had stood to make 29.1 million rand as sponsors and transaction advisors for that listing. It was clear that this had been orchestrated by Iqbal because, first, Malik Salih had sent it to Kevin for signature without any prior consultation. Then, Khalid Abdullah suggested that we sign it. Then, Salim Young, and eventually, Iqbal Survey himself.
And can we again check on the related party issue around Vunani? Mr. Evidence.
It's noted. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
It was at a meeting at the Cape Town waterfront at Workshop 17 facilities on or about the 12th of July that we, as the EXCO, resolved to raise the grievances we had with Khalid and Malik in relation to the acquisitions, including the 2% Vunani tax. The continuous interference from the AEI executives and also the incredulous resolution that was sent to the board for signature to move 1.5 billion rand in PIC money to unknown asset managers following the 400 million rand that was moved to Three Laws Capital. It was at this meeting that Khalid, in admiration of Iqbal, noted that although the process followed was incorrect, Doc was right in that we had to learn from the Gupta's mistakes. Even though they are our enemies, we need to learn from their mistakes, he said. I interpret this comment to mean that we had to move the money to various bank accounts of other entities independent of IO to avoid a situation where the money would become inaccessible should the bank accounts of IO itself be closed by any bank, as was the case with the Gupta companies. At that stage, I had already mentally checked out and had threatened to resign a number of times shortly thereafter to Kevin. In the period leading up to the interim results, Nahid, our CFO's father, fell ill and unfortunately passed away. This left a gap for AEI to deploy Malik Salih to manage the drafting of IO's interim accounts. Whilst I cannot testify as a first-hand witness of the going-ons behind the scenes, I received a WhatsApp message from Nahid in our IO executives group detailing how she was going to go to Khalid Abdullah's house with Malik Salih and Iqbal to massage the numbers for the interim report. Her obvious concern was that there was so much media scrutiny on the company at the time, and this would lead to further problems. I am aware from various internal discussions with Khalid Abdullah and Malik Salih that the clear rush to the initial listing date of 15 December 2017 was due to the impending ANC elective conference at Nasrec. There was an apprehension within the group, I imagine from Iqbal himself, that any changes to the leadership of the ANC would lead to changes in the PIC management and would thus remove whatever influence he had over the likes of Dr. Majila and Mr. Matavo. Although the listing eventually took place on 21 December 2017, it was clear from the outside that all PIC internal processes to get IO across the line in time for the listing would have to be expedited or ignored.
Sorry, can I just take you back to the point you made slightly earlier, that that Nahid Khamidil had contacted you via WhatsApp that she was going to be involved with Mr. Abdullah, Mr. Mbasali, and Mr. Survey to massage the numbers for the interim report. Do you have any idea or knowledge of what actually transpired in that? What were the actual numbers and what the massaging did? And what was the outcome of that massaging?
Thank you, Chair. My colleague, Mr. Kevin Hardy, will have, I think he's got a screenshot of what the numbers were before and what they were post that meeting, and I'm sure he'll be happy to share that with you. At the recorded meeting of 7 August 2018, post the recorded time, Iqbal went into a tirade about how he was tired of the infighting between the AO executives and the AEI executives, and that he has changed many boards before, and he will not hesitate to do so again. In reference to me, he lashed out that he had served on many boards in his life and had never felt so disrespected by my insistence that Kevin and I realign outside the room after he was forcing Kevin to call the PIC and effectively lie to them. He further went on to tell us that Dr. Majila had gotten all the executives of the PIC involved in the IO transaction to ratify it by signing a document. He was practically boasting that from a PIC point of view, there would be no ability for them to reverse or recoup the money as it was now internally ratified. As is recorded in the recording made available to the evidence team of this commission, The purpose of that meeting was to address the grave concern that we, being Kevin, Nahid, and I, had in terms of the way the company was being run, and the continuous interference of the AEI executives in the running of the company. I attached the letter as SN 3.2 and summarized the main points of contention below. 1. The continued interference by AEI executives in the daily operations of IO. 2. The continued lack of professionalism displayed by AEI executives in relation to IO and its acquisition targets, including lack of business etiquette. 3. The investigations around the PIC investment and the lack of urgency shown by AEI in dealing with this. 4. The lack of independence of the board. 5. The capability and lack of independence of the company secretary who was seconded by AEI. 6. The board resolutions relating to the transfer of huge sums of the company's money. 7. The lack of urgency in concluding acquisitions despite the high financial performance targets promised in the PLS. 8. The complete breakdown in the professional working relationship between IO executives and the AEI executives. 9. The destruction of the respective BT and Puleng Technologies relationships as a result of AEI executive interference and lack of professionalism. 10. The inflated valuation of the BT stake. 11. The breach of the JSE listing rules as a result of AEI clearly demonstrating control of IO despite both entities being listed, thus creating a pyramid structure. 12. The IO Exco operating without employment contracts. And 13. The 400 million rand loan or investment made to Three Laws Capital not being returned or properly accounted for throughout the investment or loan period. This letter was signed by the CEO, CIO, CFO of IO at the time, which made up the entire executive board of the company. Towards the end of the letter, a clear statement is made to the board that if these matters are not timely addressed, we would all resign. Needless to say, most of these matters were not addressed, and Kevin and I resigned on 21 August 2018.
Mr. Leber, is this not a convenient time to take the tea adjournment?
I was just going to suggest it, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you. Can we have the tea break there?
Yes, we'll adjourn until 11:15. Mr. Ndwele, you're still under oath.
Thank you, Chair.
You're now on page 22, paragraph 35 of your statement. Please continue.
Thank you, Chair. Whenever there were negative news articles, Iqbal insisted that Ayo put out a counter-story to change the narrative through his papers. Media articles would be written by Feroza Peterson, an AEI marketing manager, in conjunction with Khalid Abdullah. All emails in this regard would usually have Iqbal or his executive assistant Maud copied in. An example of this was the Ayo Technology and Incubation Hub, which was a bona fide idea of Kevin's to transform the sector through supporting young black entrepreneurs. However, as a ploy to change the negative media attention on the company, an article was hastily put together titled, "Union's Investment in Ayo Technology Prepares Their Sectors for a Digital Future," and published on the front page of the business report on or about 27 March 2018. Malik Salih sent me a WhatsApp message attached here too as SN4, in which he requested my selling skills to ostensibly get Questco to agree to the 1 billion rand valuation that AEI had valued its 30% stake in BTSA. A meeting was scheduled on or about 12 March 2019 with Questco, which I attended with Kevin, Malik Salih, and Nomvuyo Dube, who worked for Malik Salih in the corporate finance team. What effectively was happening was that both the buyer, represented by Kevin and I, and the seller, represented by Malik Salih and Nomvuyo Dube, were for all intents and purposes the same person, and the aim was clear that the PIC money would be used to transfer an asset between themselves. The fact that you had both the buyer and seller motivating for a transaction at the same meeting with an independent valuer resulted in the entire valuation being compromised, in my view. This view is supported by a letter from a Professor Philip Hort, dated 17 October 2017, and attached hereto as SN 4.1. The letter is addressed to Wakil McLachlan, who I believe was the Group Financial Manager of AEI, and the subject is AEI IO BT Restructure. On page 2 of the letter, Professor Hort advises as follows, I quote, "Having considered the matter, I have concluded that the most acceptable approach would be as follows. Step 1, revalue the investment and any associated rights in Kilomix to 100% of their value, say 1 billion. The reason for the revaluation would be to unlock value for AEI and AEI shareholders. Step 2, declare a dividend of 99% of this reevaluation to Kilomax and credit the amount of the dividend to a loan account in the books of Kilomix in favor of Kilomax. Step 3, the PLS on the IO listing will set out one of the reasons for raising funds being the acquisition of AEI's 30% interest in BT. Step 4, AEI will require that IO acquire such interests by subscribing for shares in Kilomix. Step 5, after listing or before if funds are available, IO subscribes for 99% of the shares in Kilomix for 1 billion rand. In brackets, please check my values. Step 6, Kilomix to use the Step 5 subscription funds to repay the 990 million rand loan owing to Kilomax. Step 7, Kilomax retains its 1% interest in Kilomix for more than 18 months. Step 8, Kilomax can distribute its dividend income to AEI, which will use it for investment and or distribution to shareholders. It has been alleged by Iqbal Survey through his various newspaper articles and as testimony to this commission that the reason that the BT transaction did not go through was because of Kevin and I wanting to close our own deals to get kickbacks. I not only reject this assertion with the contempt that it deserves, but I wish to bring this commission's attention to a letter sent from the BT head of legal dated 3 May 2018 and marked as Annexure SN6. BT had grown weary of its relationship with AEI, and at a meeting shortly thereafter at the ENS offices in Sandton, attended by Joan Shields, who was the BT acting country manager, and Bertrand Delport, the BT head of legal for Sub-Saharan Africa, the BT representatives requested Dr. Survey and Khalid Abdullah to resign from the BTSA board and were visibly furious that the IO pre-listing statement was ostensibly built around BTSA's business.
Sorry, were you present at that meeting?
Sorry, Mr. Chairperson, could you repeat that?
I'm asking, were you present?
Yes, I was present at that meeting.
Okay.
Can I just then request perhaps clarity from the team? I think that when Dr. Survey was here, he was asked whether, in fact, he was asked to resign, and he said no, he stepped down. Is that correct?
It is absolutely correct for you, Mr. Commissioner. In fact, I think the evidence was that the BT wanted some new blood on the board. And it was not true that he was asked to resign.
And in terms of that note that we had on the BT pre-listing statement, again, that was said that was part of the BT alliance agreement, not the question of BT, its involvement, and therefore it was something that was in place. In terms of what you're presenting here, Mr. Nodwena, the question is that BT were not happy with that approach. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson. I think they were furious is the word I'd use.
Coming back to, yeah, just a question. Coming back to Kilomix, the 1 billion in step one, the 1 billion rand value, was that value given to the Professor Haupt, or was that something he just said, say 1 billion rand?
Thank you, Chairperson. That is a good question. How I read it is he's giving a round number and a round figure to enable the reader to understand how the process works. It's coincidental or perhaps planned that suddenly this 1 billion rand becomes the actual value, and as I've testified, it was overvalued. So in actual fact, what I'm trying to show here is that there was no basis around the 1 billion, and it was actually used almost flippantly by Professor Haupt, and it ended up becoming the basis of the entire investment by the PIC into IO Technologies.
And that 1 billion rand was going to be used to pay out dividends to AEI shareholders at some point in time. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson.
Okay. Thank you. And this was a tax opinion, really, isn't it?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson.
Okay. Okay.
Having reviewed the statement of Iqbal's survey to this commission, it was quite evident that every single, and I repeat, every single transaction that has been subsequently concluded by IO has not been done at an arm's length and involves a related party in some form or another, or a friend of a related party. I will now deal with each of the transactions listed in his paragraph 94. Kilomix deal to acquire...
Can I just go back to one section about paragraph 36, all right? And you're talking about this company, Questco, which did the evaluation, and you are saying it was the same person both on the buying and the selling side. I mean, if you're an accredited valuer or advisory firm, what do you do in that kind of a sort of a situation where, you know, you are battling basically two sides of the same coin, you know, kind of? What happens, I mean, sort of professionally in that kind of a scenario?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think for me, the buyer is the one who should be most diligent in these processes, because ultimately this valuation insisted upon by the JSE is to assist the buyer to ensure that you do not overpay. So what happens now, Questco is offered with both the buyer and the seller, and in actual fact, for their own valuation, I don't think there was anything incorrect about what they did. Only thing is they're now listening to the same people telling them that the transaction's good. So if the buyer's in the room and you're supposed to be helping the buyer and the buyer's helping you help the buyer, then ultimately it stands to reason that the buyer should be comfortable with this. And that's why I say it was the same party, effectively being the buyer on one side and the seller on the one side, motivating for the transaction to go through. And remember, unlike in ordinary circumstances where this is supposed to assist the buyer, this is in actual fact is assisting the seller. It is the seller who will benefit from a R1 billion transfer using PIC funds.
And couldn't both the buyer and the seller have advisors?
In most instances, that would be the correct approach. But given that this was seen as a group company, and we were always told to toe the line because this is an AEI company and a Segunjalo company, our advisors were in fact AEI Corporate Finance. So it's quite strange that you find them in the same meeting with us and they're supposed to be helping us to value the stake for the benefit of our shareholders as IO. Kilomix deal to acquire 30% of BT. Overvalue transaction as discussed above, and that would see AEI pocket R1 billion from IO for a stake that they had received for free at a PE multiple of more than 20 times BT's profit after tax.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just explain what you mean by that, the PE multiple of more than 20 times?
Mr. Chair, ultimately a PE multiple is the price-earnings ratio, what you're paying and what earnings you're going to get for it. So if the number is 4 times, you're basically saying that you're prepared as a business to pay 4 times the business's earnings as the purchase price. Whereas here in the BT transaction, what IO was saying, using PIC funds, we are prepared to pay 20 times the earnings, which means it would take you 20 years before you recoup that fund, and that's excluding interest and tax. This despite AEI and survey's continued narrative to the market and this commission.
Sorry, just there, yeah, sorry to, so meaning that you are saying that BT sold this company at a high valuation to AEI and they would take a long time to realize value, you know, from that. Is that correct?
No, with respect, Mr. Chairperson, what I am saying is that BT gave the stake, and I say gave, vendor finance is similar to that because you're not putting your hands in your own pocket to take out your own funds. So BT gives a stake of 30% to AEI, and a couple of years later, AEI sells that stake at R1 billion to IO using PIC funds. Without PIC funds, I must add, there would be no transaction like this. There is no arm's length buyer for BT stake at 30% at R1 billion in this market.
Okay.
This despite AEI and survey's continued narrative to the market and this commission that they only buy companies at 4 to 6 times multiples. 2, Sizwe IT acquisition. Reverend Vugile Mahana, the longtime chairman of AEI, was a beneficiary of this transaction that saw an upfront payment of 90% being paid to the sellers, with only 10% of the funds being paid out over a very generous earnout mechanism for management. Mahana was the chairman of Sizwe, the target company, and also the chairman of Mustec, a 40% shareholder in Sizwe.
Can you please elaborate on that and explain it to the Commission in more detail?
Yes, Chair. So effectively what we're saying here is if you're going to do a transaction with a company, you are putting down a 90% deposit, which in my view is not only ludicrous but extremely generous. And you're taking the remaining 10% and you're saying based on that company's ability to meet the profit warrants that they had promised, if they don't, they are only at risk for 10% because you've already paid them 90% of the funds up front.
Just to confirm the amounts, that was 165 million rand plus advisory costs of 12 million rand.
That's correct, Mr. Chairperson. 3, Saab Grintech. AEI is a shareholder in Saab Defence. 4, Three Lows Capital, the 400 million...
On that, I think it would be just helpful if we're talking about the Saab Grintech, that one was an amount of 100 million plus advisory fees of 8 million.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. 4, Three Lows Capital, the 400 million rand loan or investment. And I must just add here, the reason I use such language, loan or investment, is because there was no document stating what this was. All we had was 400 million rand being authorized to go past, but it's hard to say whether was this an investment, and if it was an investment, where was the investment mandate, or was it a loan, and if it was a loan, where was the loan agreement? Both those documents aren't there, so it's difficult to classify what exactly this 400 million rand was that was paid over to Three Laws Capital. Has been dealt with above. Despite the testimony of Iqbal survey, the annual financial statements clearly show that another 400 million rand was invested in Three Laws Capital in November by the new board.
So if I understand you correctly from Dr. Survey's evidence here, he said that there had been 400 million invested and that was repaid, and there's a further 400 million post that was reinvested, but we don't know what the earnings were on that investment or what the document, there's no documentation on either transaction of 400 in, out and in. So we don't know, as from what I can see, and again, that's what I asked earlier, is what was the investment, what was the earning on it, and what were the arrangements made in relation to this. But my understanding from the evidence last week was that the 400 million was invested and returned. What you're saying here is that it was then reinvested. So we still have 400 million of PIC money invested in Three Laws Capital. Is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson. That is in the annual financial statements of IO.
And again, in terms of authorization of that, was that done by any IO executive, or who authorized that transfer of the second amount? The board, being the board, as you indicate here, was that the board of IO?
Mr. Chairperson, unfortunately, that was post our time, so I can only rely on what's in the financial statements, and I cannot comment on to who actually authorized that.
Can we check on that, Advocate Libba?
We'll do that, Mr. Commissioner. The November you referred to in 39.4, is that November 2018?
Yes, that is correct, Mr. Chairperson. 5, Vunani Group FinTech Fund. Vunani was the JSE sponsor for the listing of Sagamata, and as a result of not earning their fees, the 2% due diligence tax was imposed on all IO transactions, which I strongly resisted. Furthermore, they subsequently became the sponsors of IO in December 2018 when PSG Capital resigned as IO sponsors due to what would seem to be the reputational risks of being associated with IO. It should be further noted.
Can you please come again on, on that 2% DD tax? What is that?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So, whilst we were engaging with a number of potential acquisition targets, we were told, or they tried to force us, to sign this mandate with Vunani, which would see Vunani do all the due diligences on our deals. And the value or the fees that would be chargeable on that would be 2%. So you can do the maths. If you spend 4.3 billion rand and you have to spend 2% on all those deals, how lucrative that transaction was.
And then another thing to check on Vunani is that it looks like there are two transactions here. There's one for the group company, and then there's one for the fintech fund. Is that correct? Can you clarify this, please?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson. In fact, the market was only told of the creation of this fintech fund, but only when you see the annual financial statements and the presentation of Dr. Survey do you realize that there were actually two transactions. The one was the bailout of Vunani at group level through an Investec loan that they owed, and the second one was a 100 million rand creation of this fintech fund. But in most of their media articles, they'll be put together as one thing, as if it's just all a as if it's all just a fintech, venture fintech fund.
And in the document from Dr. Survey, it is listed as 245 million.
That's correct.
One amount.
One amount, that is correct.
And that relates to the earlier question of what was investment and what was expenditure in this classification.
Furthermore, they subsequently became the sponsors of IO in December 2018.
Sorry, before. So in terms of that 2% due diligence tax, did IO owe Vunani the money contractually?
No, Mr. Chairperson, I refuse to sign that mandate.
So, but I mean, did IO have a contract with Vunani in terms of those DDs which were done and money was payable, you know, the debt was?
Mr. Chairperson, not when I left. The 2% comes from the fact that Sagamata, which was the other listing of Dr. Survey's company, where Vunani was the advisor, the transactional advisor and the sponsor of that listing. And because that listing did not occur, that means there was money owed by Sagamata to Vunani. So in a way to pay it back, a scheme was created where this 2% DD tax, as I call it, was created so that Vunani could incrementally recover its funds. But clearly, as my statement shows, that by the time we had left, they already had given 145 million rand to settle the Investec debt, and also in December, IO was made Vunani its sponsor.
Okay, so the DD tax was not about the DDs done in the IO potential transactions. It was on Sagamata's DDs. Is that correct?
No, Mr. Chairperson. It was on IO's DDs, but we refused to allow that to happen. Yeah. Furthermore, they subsequently became the sponsors of IO in December 2018 when PSG Capital resigned as IO sponsors due to what would seem to be the reputational risks of being associated with IO. It should be further noted that IO has yet to reveal to the market why it paid 145 million rand to bail out Vunani Group from its obligations to Investec before it had bought any ICT company. Cortex Logic, a transaction introduced by Reverend Mahana, where his longtime friend and previous business partner, Con Bruce, is a director and shareholder. Mahana set up that meeting, which was attended by myself, Iqbal Survey, Mahana, Mr. Bruce, and the CEO of Cortex, Dr. Ludik, on 28 June 2018. I refer to the email from Dr. Ludik to Iqbal Survey under SN5. 7. Listing fees. The vast majority of this amount was paid to AEI Corporate Finance. In paragraph 90 of his testimony to this commission, and in numerous articles in his papers, Iqbal Survey suggested that Kevin and I had made the recording of the meeting on 7 July 2018. This is manifestly false, but if you listen to the recordings, you'll notice that there was one voice that was louder than all the others. This, of course, would be the person recording the meeting, and that person was Nahid Nakhamildin. In spite of this, I find it strange that board meetings dealing with such highly important matters would not be recorded. Recording of board and other exco meetings is standard business practice across the corporate sector, and such recordings are subsequently used to produce minutes of meetings. Iqbal and Khalid, having been board members of many companies, should have been well aware of that practice.
Sorry, just to go back very quickly to the items under 3.9. So in total, in terms of those different expenditures and investments, it was over 1.2 billion rand?
I haven't done the sums. I'd have to look at that.
But it would be around, given the numbers that we were trying to indicate, this would be over 1.2 billion of the 4.3 billion raised.
Dr. Iqbal Survey runs every single aspect of these companies. He plays this game with everyone where he claims to not be involved or have any knowledge of what goes on at IO, but whenever you dig a bit deeper, it is quite apparent that not only has he been briefed on any matter, but in fact he is the one who makes the ultimate decision. An example of this remains how the PIC mysteriously nominated and appointed so-called independent directors onto the board of IO.
Sorry, can you elaborate on that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. First, according to the people that were appointed, you've got Advocate Wallace Mkoki. Dr. Survey sat here and said, and referred the commission of any questions to do with IO to Mr. Mkoki. And what happened was that Mr. Mkoki was only appointed in August 2018. So how on earth he would be able to know what has happened before is beyond me. But more importantly, Mr. Mkoki was the first chairperson of the Segunjalo Investment Holdings Company. So again, this is someone who's been purported to be an independent, appointed by the PIC, but just happens to be the first chairman of Segunjalo. Could you have the list of all the directors? Just of the directors, the independent directors. Just Sorry, Mr. Chairperson, I just want to go through each director so that I can explain.
If you'll just bear with us for a moment, I think we have it available, Mr. Commissioner.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, while they go through that, I just remembered some of them. Then there's Dennis George, who was appointed as an independent. And as you would see, he was the BEE recipient of the R1.50 shares through FEDUSA and is currently under investigation by FEDUSA because FEDUSA has no clue that that transaction was done in their name. So he's, again, the PIC is appointing this person as an independent non-executive director. Then you've got Mr. Silo Rasitaba, who is part of the BBC and sat with Mr. Iqbal Survey on the BRICS Business Council. And also the BBC are beneficiaries of this BEE shareholding at R1.50. So what effectively I'm saying here is the PIC mysteriously appoints all these people who are related parties to Dr. Survey, and in actual fact, most of them are beneficiaries of the BEE deal that was done prior to the listing.
Including Mr. Ramatlodi?
Mr. Advocate Ramatlodi was appointed, if I recall, around March of 2018 and not in August, as Dr. Survey claims. Thank you, Chair. I shall now conclude my statement. I am proud of my academic background, my corporate experience, and my entrepreneurial flair. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever see myself testifying at a state commission of inquiry. Even when I indicated to Dr. Iqbal Survey that I would be resigning from the company, he offered me a job to take over as the CEO of Segunjalo, and that I would represent the company at the World Economic Forum in Davos and all important international meetings. This is not something I take lightly. I took up the job at IO because I believed in his vision for transformation. Despite this, I've been threatened by Iqbal that he and IO would bring a lawsuit for defamation against me. I've been slandered and lied about in his papers for taking a stand against corruption and corporate malfeasance. My integrity speaks for itself, and I have received plenty of support from the corporate sector that has worked with me and knows what I stand for. I am not afraid and will fight for my country, whatever the cost. I thank you, Chair.
Mr. Commissioner, I have a couple of questions to the witness, but if the Commission wants to go first, I have no problem with that.
I would prefer you to go first.
To start with, Dr. Survey testified when we asked him pertinent questions regarding AO transactions and AO business that He does not serve on the board of AO, and he has got very competent people dealing with these matters. We must ask them. He is the strategist of this multinational, and we should speak to the people running the different entities. What is your view on that?
Mr. Chair, as per my statement, Dr. Survey makes all the decisions in those companies. In fact, including my contract, Kevin's contract, everything that happened as part of IO, he was intimately involved and had to give the go-ahead before Salim Young, who was the chairman, and Khalid Abdullah, who was the CEO of AEI, could make any decisions.
And do I understand it correctly that at the time of your resignation, even at that stage, you had no written employment agreement, you and Kevin, with AO?
That is correct, Mr. Chairperson.
Now, you mentioned an answer to a question of the Commission, whether, in your view, there was a deliberate misrepresentation to the public in the listing of IO. Is that correct?
I believe, Mr. Chairperson, that in the build-up to the listing, everything was said to allow for the highest valuation possible from the PIC. And in that regard, I do believe that, yes, it was intended for that. But I must say, for that to happen, you had to also have a willing participant in the form of the Public Investment Corporation. They still had to make a decision internally whether they're going to agree with what was in the PLS or not. And therefore, I'd say that's where questions need to be asked in terms of who misled who.
The other term for this is fraud. Now, do you think that the PIC was defrauded in the sourcing of the 4.3 billion investment?
Mr. Commissioner, I'm not a criminal lawyer. I do believe, however, that given everything that happened during the build-up of this transaction, that there is definitely grounds for an investigation into what actually happened and whether this constitutes fraud.
Are you willing to participate in such an investigation? And if there's a criminal matter brought to court, will you testify?
I would, Mr. Chairperson.
Do you know of any person on the board of AO that have received money or loans from Dr. Survey or Sekunyala?
Again, Mr. Chairperson, I must caution when something is within my direct knowledge or not. I have had information which my colleague Kevin Hardy will testify to, that 1 million rand was loaned to Mr. Advocate Ramatlodi during the period of 2018, and that comes from an internal source within the company.
Now, having been involved with AO and going all through the nightmare you testified about, in your view, do you think that AO is a legitimate ICT company?
That is a difficult question, Mr. Chairperson, because on the one hand, you've got businesses like Puleng Technologies, which is a legitimate company. You've got men and women that Kevin and I hired to build up into the Sasol contract, which is a legitimate contract. On the other hand, you've got this money which, since being raised, has only been used to do related party transactions. Everything that comes out in terms of the media is manufactured. Even the financial statements in some respects are manufactured. So my answer is quite simple. There are some parts that are very legitimate, but I think on the whole, given the size of the 4.3 billion rand investment of the PIC, I think there's a greater part that isn't legitimate.
Then perhaps a difficult question. Why didn't you resign earlier?
Mr. Chairperson, as per my statement, I actually did try to resign a few times, and my colleague Kevin Hardy, rightfully I believe, stopped me from that. Number one, if we had left, who's to say what would be left of the PIC's money? Number two, we had brought on a number of professionals into the IO stable to build up for the Sasol contract. And for us to just ditch them there at the last minute to protect ourselves, I think would be not only unfair on them, but it would be unfair to the shareholders of IO.
With regards to the share trading in AO, do you personally know of any facts that would suggest that there has been share price manipulation?
Mr. Chairperson, I do not have any personal first-hand information with regards to that, but I can testify that Arthur Johnson, the Chief Investment Officer of Three Laws Capital, did confess to Kevin and I, post our resignation from IO, that he actually was instructed on a number of times by Dr. Iqbal Survey to buy up the shares of IO Technologies whenever they fell.
During his testimony, Dr.
Just on that, in relation to Mr. Johnson, and I am assuming we will get a statement from him, in buying up those IO shares, was PIC money used to do that?
That's a very good question, Mr. Chairperson, because I remind this commission that 400 million rand was sitting with Three Laws Capital at the time. So to say that PIC money was used, I cannot testify to that. Mr. Johnson would have to come forward. But ultimately what I can say is during the period of those transactions, in fact, PIC money was there. And subsequently, given the very generous dividends that IO has been declaring, there's no doubt that money is in their pockets and they're capable of doing such things.
During his testimony, Dr. Survey mentioned that he knew nothing about the BE deal that saw some parties acquire BE shares at R1.50. A couple of days before, the PIC paid 43 Rand for those shares. What is your comment on that?
Mr. Chairperson, that's absolutely false. Mr. Survey on many occasions told me that he was actually the one who financed the R1.50 vendor financing for those BE parties. So for him to stand at this commission and say he knows nothing about it, I believe is misleading.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. That is my questions.
Perhaps just a small question on your salary issue. Given that there was no contract, how was the amount negotiated, and were there payment slips or anything that would accompany that, so that you know, in a sense, what your benefits were and what arrangements there were with you? How was that arrived at, given there was no contract?
There was no contract. It was through a negotiation just before my resignation from EOH. And what happened was we were put under HST, which is one of the subsidiaries of IO. So in terms of our medical aid, in terms of our provident fund, in terms of our actual salaries themselves, it would be HST that was used to facilitate those payments.
How many subsidiaries does IO have?
Off the top of my head, there's Puleng Technologies, which was the largest before listing. There's HST, and then there's some other smaller investments, many of whom were not sizable and some were not profitable, which are negligible. In fact, I recall Kevin and I actually saying we need to start from scratch. Effectively, all you have is Puleng Technologies and HST. All the other investments really aren't contributing in terms of what the group needs to do from a services and products perspective, and we would need to build that from scratch.
All right. Two questions on BT. The first thing is, what does BT do, actually, BTSA do? Because normally we know it as a telecoms company. And then the second one is on BT, is that Victor Siani said that he struggled to get the BT financials. Was that the case, and why was that so?
Thank you, Chairperson. Perhaps maybe let me start with your second question because it's the easier of the two. Again, if you recall, BT was furious that IO had used its business case and relied on it within the PLS. And as part of that, there were many confidential, call it NDAs, between the parties to ensure that BT information was always protected. So because IO didn't get BT's permission to use those figures and that business case within the PLS, it became very difficult for now IO to give that to the PIC. And on top of that, as I mentioned, you had AEI Corporate Finance in the form of Malik Sali, who was dealing with all of this. So we'd only find out about Victor's questions only after the fact, because he'd be frustrated trying to get the numbers from Malik Sali. But I think the reason, if you're asking why did this take so long, is because a simple reading of BT's numbers would show you that that valuation was overvalued. On the second part, I think Kevin Hardy will be testifying after me, so I'd rather let him, given that he was the managing director of BT, I think he'd be better placed to take you through the full service offering rather than me.
Next one is that there's so much contention about the valuation of IO. You know, IO says it's 43 rands a share. Victor Sian and Mulebati came there. Sunil Vagiz said there was a range of some like what, 41 to 43 or some 45, somewhere there. I can be corrected. And you are saying the value is very low, you know. I mean, which is which? Which is which?
Thanks, Chair. I think it's quite simple. If you take out the PIC money from this organization, the value is not at 15 billion rand. So the question is, if I take your money and I use your money to build my business, whose valuation are you going to use? Are you going to say that this was the valuation on day one, then my money came in, and therefore the valuation is X? Or are you going to say, this is actually the valuation with or without my money, and whatever my money comes in, it should be plus whatever valuation you have? And I prefer to look at the latter, because it's easy to confuse the valuation of IO, given that acquisitions will be made. The CISO IT group, for instance, if I remember from the top of my head, was 1 billion rand revenue. So now suddenly you've got this huge jump in revenue. You can go to the market and say, look at IO, we've got 300 or whatever the number is % jump in revenue. Whereas you use money to buy that. You use my money to buy that. So how do I value that based on what my money was able to do? And more so, if you look at how dividends are paid. If I gave you 1 billion rand and I took 29% stake, I've effectively given away 71% of my money. Whatever interest you earn from that money belongs to me. So how can you say you're performing and you're doing well when it's my money that you're using? And on that valuation, again, it will show that you're making money on interest, but whose valuation are you going to rely on? Me having given away the money, or you obviously saying, here's the interest payments that I've received, I am therefore worth X? I hope that clarifies my views.
Sure. It's quite strange because the people from the PIC, I think it was Roy Raja or Mr. Madavo, said that they do not pay for the PIC doesn't pay for the value that it creates.
Well, they certainly did at this investment, Mr. Chairperson.
Another point which you mentioned is that months before this IO transaction, this listing, you say there was some foregone conclusion that this deal was going to be, to be made no matter what, Can you clarify more on that one?
I may, Mr. Chairperson. I think it was just, to put it simply, this wasn't a venture where we are going to pitch and we may or may not be successful. It was quite clear in all conversations that we went through, in the manner of how things were done, the mood, the general mood within the company was quite simple, that we need to go through this tick box exercise so that if anything happens, like for instance a commission of inquiry, we can show that these were the things that were done in raising this capital. But it's quite clear from the beginning that, you know, some commitments had been made. I don't know by whom, I don't know when, but there was such a general level of comfort that this is a foregone conclusion that we all took it as such. And I'm pretty sure anyone who's honest will testify to that.
And it seems that this is what Victor Siani actually said too, that he felt that this was done upstairs or something like that. Is that correct?
I would tend to agree with that, because as I mentioned, when we met Mr. Siani, it was a month away from the listing date for 4.3 billion rand. I had not left my position at EOH at the time. Kevin was having his farewell at BT at the time. So to say that all these things would be done by the IO executives within a month and command, excuse me, command such a high valuation, it's amazing. It's brilliant, but I don't think we were that good.
The final question is, you are saying that the company didn't want to acquire those businesses which you guys showed them. Why is that so? I mean, why is what could be the reason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. So as I said, for you to call yourself a leading ICT company, there has to be a certain makeup, a certain DNA from a services and offerings and products perspective, so that the market can take you seriously. You know, what can you do for me if you say you're an ICT company? These are the things that you need. And we had put that together in terms of our plans, which you'll see, I think it's in SN1, the market sounding board. All that market information is there. What you need to build, what type of services does the market need to take you seriously? So when we realized that this is not happening, it became a problem for us, because the first question is, number one, if you go to a customer, what are you going to sell? You know, yes, you've got this Sasol contract, but that's as a result of your BT alliance agreement. But you as an ICT company, a bona fide ICT company, if you go to a customer and say, Mr. Bank or Mr. Insurer, Mr. Mine, these are my products and services that I want to sell to you. There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. So we had to spend. It had to be done. That money had to be deployed to acquire decent companies to give a service offering. So the fact that it didn't really, really puzzled me, because then are we really an ICT company if we've got 4.3 billion rand in the bank and we're not spending it on what we said to the market we're going to spend it on? I found that quite strange, and I think, as I mentioned in our letter to the board prior to our resignation, that was one of the biggest bones of contention on our part. We had promised the market, in terms of the PLS, a very high revenue target, a very high profit target, yet there was no urgency whatsoever from the AEI executives to conclude these transactions.
And if I recall, Dr. Seve said that at some point in time, I think he stopped you guys from buying the company because he felt that you people had an in with these companies, that you wanted to do something there. Can you recall that? He said that. I
do recall that, Mr. Chairperson, and as I've dealt with in my statement, I reject that. I reject that with the contempt that it deserves. And I hate to get personal, but that's a blatant lie. And I think that's one of the most disappointing things about this process. It's one thing that we've walked away and we've said we want nothing to do with this company, but for them to continuously lie, to use their papers to slander us on a daily basis, and knowing full well we don't have 100 titles across the country. We're defenseless when it comes to this, and that's one of the reasons we're here, to defend our names, to clear our names, to say we are professionals. We are proud of the job that we did at IO, and we won't be disrespected by the likes of Dr. Survey.
Finally, do you think that the company uses its media platform to promote itself or to, you know, to do other things? I mean, is there some editorial independence in the newspapers and the media platform?
Thank you, Chairperson. I think to answer that question, let me take a step back to the original board of IO on listing. You had 3 non-executive directors that were independent media employees, and these are supposed to be independent non-executive directors. Subsequent to that, you've got Takudzo Hove, who's the Chief Financial Officer of Independent Media, who sits on the board of IO Technologies. You've got the Executive Director for HR of Independent Media, who sits on the board of IO Technologies. You've got all these people who are independent media people. And of course, the CEO, Mr. Howard PIC, is the digital head of Independent Media, who is now the CEO of IO Technologies. So given this very close relationship between the two, it was very easy for Dr. Survey, Mr. Abdullah, or whomever during the group to say, guys, we need an article to come out. This is what the article should say. This is what people should be quoted. So an example is a guy like Dennis George, for instance. He'd be called after the article has been written to say, we're going to attribute these quotes to you. Kevin Hardy can speak for himself, how when the BT transaction was announced, he was quoted as having said that 600 people will be coming across. Now, firstly, that's factually incorrect. Only 50 people are going to come across from BT. But because the editorial independence of independent media does not exist, it sits in the hands of Dr. Iqbal Survey. Anything he says he wants to publish will be published. And again, we've been victims of that, given our stance and inability to play ball as they would like us to.
But I mean, don't you have professional journalists there and the editors and all those professionals?
Mr. Chairperson, without going into detail of the staff profile of the independent media group, because I'm not familiar with it, I'm sure there are good men and women in there, the same as there are good men and women at IO. But the factual reality is all power sits with one person. And even though you have good people in there, I'm pretty sure for their jobs and livelihoods, they will toe the line as per Dr. Survey's wishes.
Thanks, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Mr. Commissioner, I have 2 more questions with your permission. I forgot to ask you that. During all the meetings you had pre-listing, was there at any time a discussion or debate on the 43 rand per share, or was it just accepted as a done deal?
Mr. Chairperson, so within the AEI corporate finance stable and the IO stable, as I had mentioned, it was quite clear what Malik Salih's job was in that process, and that was to get the highest valuation possible in the shortest period of time. Having said that, there was pushback from the PIC. I recall in our first meeting with Mr. Siani that he found the valuation rich, which it was. But it's quite clear that subsequent to that, that became acceptable to the PIC, and I cannot comment as to why that was the case.
Thank you. My last question is, it was mentioned by Dr. Survey that at one stage, Victor Sehane, or another official at PIC, indicated that PIC is not interested in the BT deal anymore.
Mr. Chairperson, that is false. I don't recall anyone at the PIC saying they're no longer interested in the BT transaction.
That concludes my questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Just a quick one. What are you doing now? What's happening in your life at the moment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'm the General Counsel and Chief Investment Officer of the Matupa Investment Group.
Well, the only question that I have for you is whether you would be able to come back were you to be required to come back to testify further.
I certainly would, Mr. Chairperson.
What remains is to thank you for your time and thank you for the evidence that you've placed before us. There are certainly some contradictions between you and Dr. Survey, but I suppose those will be cleared later on. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Mr. Commissioner, we are ready to proceed. We have two options: to take an early lunch or to take a 5-minute adjournment to rearrange the chairs and start with the second witness.
The suggestion is that we take lunch now and come back at 1:15. We'll then adjourn until 1:15.
Thank you.